And in that cave, he shrank into shame, and he disappeared into oblivion. But we need to use Lot's example as a warning to us. Paul said in Romans 15, verse 4, "For whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we through the patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope." Before I talk with you about the mistakes that Lot made in his life, I want to remind you that he had a lot going for him. For example, he left the idolatry of his grandfather. Joshua, in Joshua 24 and verse 2, reminded the Israelites that their fathers in old times had served other gods. And he mentioned the name of Terah. And Terah was the father of Haran, who was the father of Lot. Lot left the idolatry of his grandfather. And then he had the good influence of godly relatives. Abraham was his uncle, and after his father died, Abraham pretty much adopted Lot as his son. And I'm sure you remember that when Abraham left Haran to go into the land of Canaan, Lot went with him. We're told in Genesis chapter 12, verse 4, "So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him." And we certainly know that Abraham was a godly man of faith. I'll not say more about that right now because I'm planning to talk with you about the faith of Abraham in the 1030 period of worship. But the Scriptures do tell us that Abraham was such a righteous man that he is described as a friend of God. He is described as the father of the faithful. Now, while it's certainly true that godly men do not always influence their family to live in a godly way, Eli and Samuel illustrate the point. They were godly men, but their sons were not. But that was not the case with Abraham. Abraham was a godly man who influenced his family and his household to live in a godly way. In Genesis chapter 18 and verse 19, God says, "For I have known him in order that he may command his children and his household after him, that they keep the way of the Lord to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has spoken to him." And so I think there can be no doubt that Lot was influenced by the godly example of his uncle Abraham to be a godly man himself. And he had wealth. We are told in Genesis chapter 13, verse 5, Lot also, who went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. Now, we all understand that wealth can be a hindrance to spirituality, but so can poverty. And wealth doesn't have to influence us in our service to the Lord. Perhaps most importantly, Peter tells us that Lot was a righteous man. He writes in 2 Peter 2, verse 7, that God delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked. And then he says parenthetically in the next verse, "For that righteous man dwelling among them tormented his righteous soul from day to day by seeing and hearing their lawless deeds." You're familiar, I'm sure, with Lot's story. And we're not going to have time to read very much of that story, but let me remind you that the very fact that Lot had two virgin daughters in a cesspool like Sodom indicates that he had influenced his family and his community. And then no doubt you remember that when the angels came to Sodom in Genesis chapter 19 to warn Lot that God was about to destroy that city because of its wickedness, Lot extended hospitality to those men, or those angels, not knowing at the time who they were. They were planning to spend the night in the open square, and you'll remember that Lot insisted that they not do that, but rather they come to his house. I think the Hebrew writer alludes to the hospitality of Abraham in the previous chapter, Genesis 18, and the hospitality of Lot in Genesis 19, when he wrote in chapter 13, verse 1, "Let brotherly love continue. Do not forget to entertain strangers, for by so doing some have unwittingly entertained angels." So Lot had several things going for him. But Lot made a bad decision that proved to be the ruin of his life. In Genesis chapter 13, the record tells us, beginning in verse 7, "And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. The Canaanites and the Perizzites then dwelt in the land. So Abram said to Lot, 'Please let there be no strife between you and me, and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brethren. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If you take the left, then I will go to the right. Or if you go to the right, then I will go to the left.' And Lot lifted his eyes and saw all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere." And then Moses says parenthetically, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, "Like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as you go toward Zoar." That's how luscious that area was at that time. And then Moses tells us in verse 11, "Then Lot chose for himself all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated from each other. Abraham dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent even as far as Sodom." But then Moses says in the next verse, "But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord." I believe that this decision on the part of Lot reflects some bad attitudes. I think Lot was thinking primarily about the present, not the future. That Lot was thinking about himself and not others. Of course, the New Testament clearly tells us that we need to have a very different attitude. Paul told the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 24, "Let no one seek his own, but each the other's well-being." It seems to me that Lot was thinking primarily about the gain that he would receive in the well-watered plains of the Jordan, rather than the cost that decision might be as far as his relationship with God is concerned. Jesus tells us in Luke chapter 14 that we need to count the cost. He said, "For which of you, intending to build a tower, does not sit down first and count the cost, whether he has enough to finish it? Lest after he has laid the foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, 'This man began to build and was not able to finish.' Or what king going to make war against another king does not sit down first and consider whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000? Or else, while the other is still a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks conditions of peace. It seems to me that Lot's decision to go to the well-watered plains of the Jordan was based on a carnal mind rather than a spiritual mind. And that decision started a series of steps unforeseen by Lot at the time that ultimately caused his downfall. Look at the progression in the story. We're told that Lot looked toward Sodom, that he chose the plain of the Jordan, that he moved his tent toward Sodom, that he dwelt in Sodom, and finally that he sat in the gate of Sodom. I'm sure you remember that the city gate was the place where people would congregate, business transactions were made, rulings by judges were administered. And so the very fact that we're told that Lot sat in the gate may be an indication that he was some man of position and prominence and power in Sodom at that time. But the story of Lot certainly indicates that he reaped the wages of sin. Peter tells us in the passage that I read a moment ago that in Sodom Lot was vexed by the wickedness of the Sodomites. The extreme wickedness of the inhabitants of Sodom is evidenced by the fact that in Genesis 19, when the angels come to Sodom to warn Lot of its destruction, that before Lot and his guests could retire for the night, the men of Sodom gathered outside Lot's door. You remember that part of the story, don't you? And we're told that these men were both young and old alike. We're told that they came from every quarter of the city. And they didn't whisper their sordid lust in secret. They shouted openly in the streets, "Bring these men out that we might know them." And of course they meant know them in a carnal or sexual way. No wonder Peter tells us that Lot was sore distressed and vexed. But then the story also indicates that Lot's own moral standard became confused. Although he shielded his guests at first from the mob with his own body, he offered his own daughters to them. I must tell you that just astounds me. That is difficult to explain and understand. Perhaps Lot had begun to suspect the true identity of these men, and therefore perhaps he believed that he needed to protect them at all cost. Hospitality was a very important virtue in ancient times. More important than I think it is today. But I think what Paul did, or what, I'm having trouble this morning. I think what Lot did is a clear illustration of the fact that a virtue can be inflated to a vice. You can have too much of a good thing. Even good things can be corrupted. And then Lot lost everything. When he left the city, he left his married daughters and his sons-in-law behind. His sons. Perhaps grandchildren. The text doesn't really tell us anything about that. He certainly left his wealth behind, his home, and we all remember what happened to Lot's wife, right? The angel said, "Flee, don't look back," and she looked back and became a pillar of salt. I like what the Wycliffe Bible Commentary said. She stood a silent sentinel to sordid selfishness. I'm not the only one that likes alliteration. And then he lost his perspective about what was really important. Do you remember that the angels told Lot to flee to the mountains? Do you remember what Lot did? Do you remember how he responded? He said, "Oh, let me stay in this small city, the city of Zoar." It seems to me that if I had been in Lot's shoes and the angel who told me that Sodom's going to be destroyed, and the angel who said flee to the mountains, I think I would have hightailed it to the mountains. But that's not what Lot did. He was afraid to live in the mountains, and so he asked that Zoar be spared, and graciously the angels acquiesced. But shouldn't he have known that the God who spared him from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah would be able to protect him in whatever place God said go? And then Lot's own faith and righteousness were weakened. Do you remember that Lot went out of Zoar and he dwelt in the mountains? Isn't that interesting? He finally goes where the angel said go in the first place. And his daughters, who left with him, lamented the fact that they had no husband, and so they decided, we'll get our father drunk and conceive by our father. Now, I've already mentioned the fact that Peter tells us that Lot was a righteous man. And because Peter describes Lot in that way, some have argued that Lot gets a bad rap in a sermon like this. But may I suggest to you that I don't think that's true, for at least three reasons. First of all, Peter describes Lot as a righteous man at a particular point in time while he was dwelling in Sodom, I think before the angel's visit. And then secondly, I don't think Lot's getting a bad rap in this sermon because the Bible clearly indicates that righteous people can make bad decisions. King Josiah, was a righteous man. But he made a bad decision when he went out to battle against Pharaoh Necho. And certainly David was a righteous man. But he made a series of bad decisions when he committed adultery with Bathsheba and then tried to cover it up. And Peter was a righteous man, but he made a bad decision when he snubbed his Gentile brethren in Antioch. But then the third thing that I would say about this is the Bible clearly tells us that righteous people can become unrighteous. Ezekiel writes in Ezekiel chapter 18 and verse 24, "But when a righteous man turns away from his righteousness and commits iniquity, and does according to all the abominations that the wicked man does, shall he live?" Well, he answers his own question. "All the righteousness which he has done shall not be remembered, because of the unfaithfulness of which he is guilty, and the sin which he has committed, because of them he shall die." We just talked about the fact that Lot's virgin daughters were corrupted morally. And then in addition to that, the Bible indicates that the descendants, through that incestuous relationship, became the inveterate enemies of God's people. The son named Moab, which means from the father, was the father of the Moabites. And the Moabites provided the worst carnal seduction in the history of Israel at Baal Peor in Numbers chapter 25. And the son named Ben-Ammi, which means son of my people, was the father of the Ammonites. And they later influenced Israel to worship Molech. And so I think we need to ask the question, why did all of this happen? And I think the answer at least begins because Lot pitched his tent towards Sodom. It seems that Lot didn't recognize the danger of Sodom's corrupting environment. Perhaps he thought that he was strong enough to resist that influence. But may I remind you that Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 10 verse 12, "Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall." The minute anyone begins to think, well, I'd never do that, he's setting himself up for a fall. It's foolish to go towards Sodom if you want to stay out of Sodom. And I think many today do not recognize the danger of corrupting environments. They don't recognize the danger of hanging out with the wrong kinds of friends. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:33, "Do not be deceived. Evil company corrupts good habits." And so that means we need to avoid the wrong kinds of friends. And the book of Proverbs has a lot to say about that. For example, in Proverbs 22, verse 24 and 25, "Make no friendship with an angry man, and with a furious man do not go, lest you learn his ways and set a snare for your soul." Wicked people have a tendency to rub off on the righteous. Of course, I think there's a lot of truth in the old adage that says birds of a feather flock together. It means not only must we avoid the wrong kinds of friends, we must associate with the right kinds of friends. The wise man tells us in Proverbs 13, verse 20, "He who walks with wise men will be wise, but the companion of fools will be destroyed." Many people today do not recognize the danger of choosing the wrong kind of career. Some careers are just not conducive to family time and spirituality. I so much appreciate the decision that Brother Luke Douthit made when he was in medical school. Surgery, I think, was very tempting as an area of medicine for him to go into, but Luke was worried that that would really impact his time with his family. And so Luke chose to become an anesthesiologist. A lot of people don't appreciate the danger of going to the wrong kind of places. If you remember the old Flip Wilson show and you remember his character Geraldine and her boyfriend Killer, Geraldine would talk about the fact that she and Killer would go to the booth in the back, in the corner, and in the dark. And let me tell you, folks, that's not the place to flee fornication. A lot of folks don't recognize the danger of going to the wrong kind of movies and listening to the wrong kind of music and marrying the wrong kind of person. I must tell you, I don't think it's sinful for a Christian to marry a non-Christian, but I don't think it's wise. Nehemiah writes in Nehemiah 13, verse 26, after many Jewish people had intermarried with foreigners in the days of Nehemiah, Nehemiah asked the question, "Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin by these things? Yet among many nations there was no king like him, who was beloved of his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, pagan women caused even him to sin. Should we then hear of your doing all this great evil, transgressing against our God by marrying pagan women? If the wisest man of his generation was corrupted by his wives, should we pause and think about that?" The Scriptures repeatedly warn us about too much familiarity with the world. The very first psalm says in the first verse, "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the path of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful." The wise man tells us in Proverbs 4, verse 14 and 15, "Do not enter the path of the wicked, and do not walk in the way of evil. Avoid it, do not travel on it, turn away from it, and pass on." Now, please don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I am not saying that we should isolate ourselves from the world. But I'm saying we shouldn't become too intimate with the world either. We've got to be insulated from the world. I think that's what Jesus had in mind when he prayed in John 17, verse 15 and 16. "I do not pray that you should take them out of the world, but that you should keep them from the evil one. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world." What a terrible price Lot paid for a bad decision. He inched closer and closer to sin. He began to reflect his own environment. He sunk into shame. And he disappeared into oblivion. What's the lesson for us? Don't pitch your tent toward Sodom. The story of Lot, I think, clearly illustrates the truth of Paul's words to the Galatians. In Galatians chapter 6, verse 7 and 8, do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. For he who sows to his flesh will of the flesh reap corruption. But he who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life. Thank you.